It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Agi, internationally recognized and
renowned
and respected ecologist, naturalist, and biodiversity expert. Wow. She is the main biodiversity expert, the lead biodiversity expert in the World Bank. Please welcome Agi Kish, where she will have.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out.
What's happening?
I turned it off. Until she's ready for the picture. I turned it off.
So I really appreciate your coming out, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about biodiversity and also about writing, and particularly fiction, as a way of informing people about the importance of biodiversity and what we can do about biodiversity loss. So that will be the topic of the discussion today. And I would like to encourage, if you have any questions or comments while we go along, please ask them. It should be really a very informal. Please come in. Welcome. I'd like it to be a very informal discussion. And if you have experiences to share, for example, that come up as we're talking, then I would really encourage you to do that as well. So I think we'll dim the lights in order to see the slides better and get started. So, all right, we're going to be talking about first of all, what is biodiversity, and probably people in the room already know, but we'll just make sure everybody's on the same page on the definition of it. What's happening to biodiversity and why is it happening? Then why do we care? What are we doing about the loss of biodiversity? By we, it's the conservation community, the environmental community in the world. And then finally, next slide, how can fiction help? That's the core of this particular presentation. So next slide, please. So let me just start with ecology. I'm actually an ecologist and an entomologist. And just to start with some definitions, that ecology is the study of living things and their environment and the relationship between the two. And we, ecologists, basically are famous for always pointing out that everything is connected to everything else. That's the basic definition of ecology. And I particularly like this slide, both because, of course, it's very beautiful, but also because it shows that human beings are part of this whole fabric as well. And we're connected to everything else as well. Next slide. So just to make a demonstration of this interconnectedness, this is something I came across really just very recently. This is brand new information from NASA. One thing, the Amazon basin that I'm sure that you've all heard of, the big forest in South America, and one of the characteristics of the Amazon basin is that the soils are very fragile, they're easily eroded, they're easily leached, and they're very low in phosphorus, which is a limitation on the life that can be pursued there. So this is a problem that it loses phosphorus and the soils are very low in phosphorus. Next slide. At the same time, we have these dust storms in the Sahara Desert. For example, in Chad, there's a place called the Bodeli Depression, which is an ancient lake bed, and this dust is very rich in phosphorus. I think you can probably see where I'm going with this. The next slide shows the new data from NASA, and you can see dust blowing from the Sahara over to the Amazon. About 28 million tons of phosphorus-rich dust blows across the Atlantic Ocean to the Sahara, to the Amazon every year, and this basically replenishes the phosphorus that is lost every year. It's a fairly even replacement of the phosphorus that's lost.
Has that been going on for a long period of time?
Millennia.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a recent thing. This is a natural phenomenon. And that's probably one of the reasons that the Amazon jungle is actually so rich in life, is because there has been this constant process of replenishment. So I was just amazed, these fantastic photos from NASA that show this in progress. Okay, next slide, please. So, any guesses who this is?
Looks like my backyard.
Yeah, very close. It's your backyard if your backyard were in East Africa. It's a geranuk, but it's very closely related. It's called a geranuk. It's an antelope, but it's very closely related to the deer that you all enjoy having in your backyard. Okay, next slide. So just quickly a definition. What is biodiversity? Next. So this is the general definition that we use. It's the totality of life on Earth, all its variations at all levels. So from genes to species to communities to ecosystems and ecological processes. So it's not just the animals and the plants, it's the entirety of life and all living systems is what we call biodiversity. What is conservation of biodiversity? It's maintaining these species and systems and variations and processes. And the important thing is that we're talking about preserving, as we say, the library, not just the books. So it's not only the animals and plants, but also the habitats that contain them and support them, and also the processes that generate them. So we have a very broad definition of biodiversity and what we're trying to say. It's going a little too fast.
Okay.
Okay, all right, but yes, you can go. Sorry. Okay, so very often, people immediately go to what we call the charismatic megafauna, which we scientists like to call cute animals. And we like these technical terms. And this particular one is actually very interesting. This is one of the first photographs of this animal. It's been known to exist for many years, but it is very difficult to photograph because it hides in the rocks. It's from China. It's called an ilitica. It's very closely related to rabbits. You can just imagine if you were to extend those ears up a bit, you'd pretty much be seeing a very cute rabbit. There are probably about 10 or 20,000 of these left in the world, or in all of them in the mountains of China, but they're very, very difficult to see. So you can't always only conserve what is easy to see out there. You have to go under the surface. Okay, next slide. But the other thing to remember is all of these charismatic megafauna fall within the vertebrates, which is a tiny, tiny sliver of the identified species in the world. So when we think of all of the animals, that we care about and protect, the ones, the cute faces, it's a very, very tiny subset of the 1%, which are the vertebrates. And you can see which is the largest single group of organisms. It's the beetles, not all even bugs, just beetles. So the next slide. And this is just, a small, tiny sample. There are about 350,000 species of identified beetles, probably several million not identified yet. And B.S. Haldane, a scientist from the 19th century, was famous for saying that God has an inordinate fondness for beetles, if you just judge by what he's created most of. He actually, in different places, he said beetles and stars sometimes, because he also seems to have created a lot of stars. That was the idea. The other thing he was famous for saying, if I could get the next slide, when we meet the Almighty face to face, he will resemble a beetle or a star, and not Dr. Carey, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he said this, as you can imagine, in debates, when he was basically making the point that if we imagine that God made in his own image something frequently, then he must look like a beetle. He was probably not very well appreciated in the Christian community for this comment. Okay, now the thing is, though, as an entomologist, I happen to think that also beetles can be cute. So, okay, next slide. And also, as an entomologist, I've studied insects, and I think that they can be fantastic and beautiful. These are a class of insects called membracids. They're also called tree hoppers, and they're related to aphids. That's the closest relatives that you're probably familiar with. They're quite small, just about a quarter inch, most of these. These are all from Central America and South America, where they become, develop into these amazing camouflage forms. Next slide. This particular one is perhaps not quite as beautiful and spectacular as some of the others, but it has the good fortune to have been one of the animals I studied for my PhD, so it's equally important. It's called Encanopa binotata, and it's a thorn mimic that sits on black locust trees, and it's very hard to see them because they look just like the black locust thorns. So it's just an example of the kind of diversity that you can get even within one subgroup of insects. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next part of the talk on what's happening to biodiversity. Next slide. We've got some good news stories. Unfortunately, a lot of bad news stories. These on the top are all species that have come very close to the brink of extinction, but in one way or another have been brought back, at least for now, from the brink of extinction. We have the golden lion tamarin in the upper left-hand corner from the Brazilian rainforest, the California condor flying there, which my mother and I were fortunate enough to see in flight once on a visit to California. Black-footed ferret. This is called a weta. It's from New Zealand, a rather large cricket. And this one I put in because the lynx is a very highly endangered group of cats. This particular one was recently spotted in Hungary, so I had to put it in. The first one seen in Hungary in some years. So most of these species are the subject of very intense recovery efforts, very intense, expensive recovery efforts. Unfortunately, there's also bad news of species that have gone extinct in recent years. This is obviously a tiny, tiny subset of the ones that have, but some that I just chose. The quagga, which is on the lower left, a relative of the zebra, a golden toad from South America, the Tasmanian tiger, the dodo bird. These are just standing in for the large number of species that have unfortunately gone extinct. Yes, of course, please.
Has there ever been an instance where a species has gone extinct or thought was extinct, and without the recovery efforts, one was discovered?
Oh yes, that has happened. For example, there was a monkey species in West Africa. I've forgotten the name of it. It has a sort of a strange leafy structure on its nose that was not seen for about 50 years, and then somebody actually saw one. So it means that it's in very, very low numbers, of course. But I mean, obviously it had not really gone extinct. It had just gone to such low populations that people hadn't seen it for a long time. It does happen, but for the most part, when we identify a species as being on the brink of extinction, if we really want to hang on to it, it's a major effort. Okay, next slide, please. So basically what we can say is that we're winning a few battles like these. I would say overall losing the war. You have 121 new species listed as endangered since the year 2000. Actually, this slide I prepared a couple of years ago, so I'm sure it's more than that. And this is just the new animal species that are listed as endangered. And in order to be listed as endangered, somebody actually has to be looking for it and has to have demonstrated through some effort that it is not to be found where you're looking for it. So this is, of course, an underestimate. Yes, please.
Didn't Lewis Carroll write about the dodo bird in Alice in Wonderland? I always thought it was just made up.
Oh, no. It was a real bird.
He wrote about the bird. Maybe it was in the verge of going extinct or something.
Yes, unfortunately, the dodo was a bird that was completely unused to humans. It was directly hunted into extinction. It's basically a big, tasty pigeon. And it was from the island of Mauritius, and when sailors would go there, it was very easy to catch and kill the dodos because they had no fear of humans, and they basically just ate them into extinction. So next slide. So what are the reasons that biodiversity is disappearing? There are a lot of reasons. They're probably not too much of a surprise. I mean, we know about destruction of habitat and over-harvesting of trees, that sort of thing. Invasive alien species. Can anybody by any chance guess what this little critter might be?
Tick.
Very close. It's very close to being a tick. It's actually a mite. It's one of the two types of mites that most people believe is primarily responsible for the honeybee collapse that's ongoing.
Wait. Because they eat them?
They infect the hives and they destroy the eggs. Yeah.
Which hives?
The honeybee hives. So they get into the hives. And they probably, it's probably not just them. There's also, is it on some kind of automatic or something? So it's probably not just these mites. There's also probably pesticides involved and various other things. Nobody knows exactly why. But I think I saw some nodding around the room that you know that we have a terrible problem of the disappearance of honeybees. It's a huge issue. So, but this is an invasive alien species. It was accidentally introduced. I don't remember exactly how these were, but it's often a big problem that species that are in balance in one area, one part of the world, are either accidentally or purposefully introduced into another part of the world where they can wreak havoc, like with the honeybees. We have pollution, of course, water and air. We have agricultural encroachment, just people taking up more and more space in the world and cutting down forests for agriculture, of course. And human-wildlife conflict. This often comes with this encroachment. We think of it, for example, African villages. in conflict with elephants that come and eat their crops. But it's the same thing when people build their houses in Colorado in mountain lion territory and then want the Fish and Wildlife Service to get rid of the mountain lions. It's the same sort of thing, human-wildlife conflict. Just people taking up more space and sort of squeezing the animals out. Next slide, please. Okay, so why do we care? I mean, probably people in this room care anyway, but there are some very particular reasons to care. And next slide. This is just to show sort of the progression of thinking over the past 40 years or so of what has been sort of in the biodiversity and environmental community. Next slide. So 40, 50 years ago, there was just this feeling, people would just say biodiversity should just be protected, and people set up protected areas and that sort of thing. I mean, biologists are convinced about this. Not everybody is, right? If they get in interfering with economic development, this is not always a good enough reason. Next slide. Then we entered into a period of saying that biodiversity should be preserved, but it should pay for itself, and I'll have some slides that talk about this a bit more, that if we're going to protect biodiversity and continue to have it, it should have an economic value. It should basically pay for its place in the world. And there's been a lot of effort to generate income from biodiversity in order to make sure that people have an economic incentive for preserving it. And then next. Then in 2000, there was the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, which have now been updated in 2015, mainly because the goals were not reached by 2015, which is what they were supposed to have been. But the whole concept there was to put biodiversity in the context of poverty and around the world, and saying that biodiversity is actually important for maintaining people's livelihoods, and that loss of biodiversity causes poverty. And so some examples coming up. Next slide. Okay. Anybody? Oh, yeah. The horseshoe crabs. I don't know if people are familiar with the horseshoe crab story.
No.
Okay, good. Some people are. First of all, I just want to mention, although of course they're called horseshoe crabs, and everybody calls them horseshoe crabs, they're actually more closely related to spiders than they are to crabs. Just as a point of interest. Yeah. And they're very, the beaches of Delaware Bay actually are the single greatest concentration of horseshoe crabs in the world. And every year they come up to lay their eggs on the sand, and this is something that's been going on for millions and millions of years, and it's an enormous spectacle when these hundreds of thousands of horseshoe crabs come up onto the beach to lay their eggs. And then you have a lot of shorebirds that basically use these eggs, which are very rich in lipids, and it's a primary fuel source for them as they're getting ready to fly, to migrate. And so it's very important for them. Next slide, please. But this is just an example of biodiversity's usefulness to humans, that horseshoe crab blood is the source of this lysate clotting factor, which is extremely important in biomedical research and in basically testing intravenous drugs to make sure that they don't contain toxic bacteria that will then affect the patient. And so it's tested with blood from the horseshoe crabs. And they bleed the crabs and then release them. So they don't kill the crabs to bleed them, but they collect thousands and thousands of horseshoe crabs every year and extract this material from their blood, and it still has not been synthesized. This is still the way
So
that
it's
they
sort
do
of kind
it.
of like a blood drive?
Exactly. An involuntary blood drive. So it's just one example of biodiversity serving humanity, basically. Next slide is a little bit more direct on this idea of biodiversity and poverty. This is an example from East Africa, Lake Victoria here, where you have Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania all surround Lake Victoria. And I don't know if any of you keep tropical fish or know anybody who does, but the cichlid fish are famous for both being beautifully, brightly colored, and also for having evolved amazing reproductive strategies. For example, you might have heard of the fish that when the eggs hatch, the father and mother hold the babies inside their mouths and until they're old enough to swim free. That's one of the cichlids. So Conrad Lawrence wrote about cichlids and their behavior. They're just an amazing group of fish. Okay, and they live in the Great Rift Lakes of Africa, including Lake Victoria and Lake Malawi. So next slide. Until about 1970, there were about 350 species of these cichlids in the lake. Today, there are hardly any. Most of the species have gone extinct. It used to be sort of the aquatic Galapagos, you know, that you had all of these different varieties. And most of them are now extinct or very rare, just since 1970. Well, what's happened? Next slide. So there were two main things that happened. First was the introduction of the Nile perch and the Nile tilapia, two fish that are good eating fish, to create a commercial fishery. And for a while it was a very successful thing. It generated a lot of money, but the problem is that basically these big fish ate up all the cichlids, more or less. Then also they developed a big sugarcane industry along the shores of the lake, and the pesticides and the soil erosion have basically destroyed the habitat for these fish. So aside from losing spectacular species of fish, what else has that caused? Next slide. Well, it has had a major impact on the people living in the area, because they used to collect these fish, and they had a fishing industry. You had thousands of people who were living from this industry. And although there was a lot of money generated by the Nile perch and the Nile tilapia, first of all, none of it came to those people because they just set up big factories, you know, and so there were foreign investors that were getting all that money. In the meantime, the fishery has pretty much collapsed anyway. Because, for various reasons that is too complicated to get into now. But it had its day, and now it's not very productive anymore. You had the soil pesticide. Basically, you have major impoverishment of the people living in the area because their livelihood disappeared and they were not able to participate in what replaced it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what are we doing about all of this? This is where my colleagues and I hopefully come in. Next slide. There are a number of things. First of all is just direct protection. There's a lot of that. You know, setting up protected areas. This is a national park. These are the extremely brave men and women who guard these national parks. It's an extremely dangerous business, particularly in Africa and East Asia. Many park guards are killed every year. And then trade bans. For example, this is a big pile of ivory that was collected from poachers, and in the mid-1990s, there was a big deal where Richard Leakey, who was the head of the Kenya Wildlife Service, burned an enormous pile of ivory to demonstrate that this should not be something that we deal in. You know, so he was criticized because this is probably $20 million worth of ivory, but he did not want it to go into a commercial, so he wanted to make a point. And I think he probably got more than $20 million worth of advertising for his idea as a result. Okay, so we have direct protection, and then the next slide, please. We also have these kinds of technological things that we're doing, gene banks and captive breeding, like with the golden lion tamarin. This is an interesting one where the Tasmanian tiger is not actually a tiger, it's more like a dog, but they call it the tiger because of the stripes. They've actually been trying to recreate it from cloning from specimens that have been preserved, you know, skins and that sort of thing. And there's an ongoing research program to try to recreate the Tasmanian tiger from cloned cells in the skins. You know, it's an interesting research project. The Tasmanian tiger's habitat has basically disappeared, so I'm not sure what they're going to do with them if they actually do recreate them. But of course, there's also, biotechnology comes with a lot of controversy. Because not only can you recreate things that once existed, but of course there's the temptation to create new things, which may or may not be a good idea. I mean, I'm not sure anybody's worried about a tiger bunny. You know, that's probably...
made up, or is that
That's made up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I got really nervous.
I know. This was actually from an advertisement for some computer program, some graphic program. Yeah, so we're not really worried about tiger bunnies. We're worried about other kinds of created organisms, microorganisms that could go out of control, that sort of thing. But anyway, there are technological things that people are doing. Again, they tend to be pretty expensive, and you can't do it for large numbers of species. Next slide. And then there's this whole concept that in most places, it's really sort of local communities needing resources that are the main source of loss of biodiversity in many places. So part of the idea is to help local communities actually gain economically from maintaining the biodiversity instead of destroying it. And this is, remember what I was saying, biodiversity earning its own way. You know, hunting actually, although I'm not a big fan personally, it can be a major source of economic gain for local communities. You know, the safari hunter will come in and, for whatever reason, spend $30,000 to shoot a lion. Well, if a significant part of that comes back to the community might be a little bit less unhappy about having lions around eating their livestock from time to time. Because they might lose a cow or a goat here or there, but they also can get tens of thousands of dollars from the hunters. I personally prefer the tourism route. This is in Uganda. That's a mountain gorilla there that you can see, and a group of people. Amazing experience to go and see these animals in the wild. They're much, much bigger than you think. And then just basically local empowerment, working with the local communities to try to find ways to help them partner with biodiversity instead of displacing or destroying it. So there are things that we're trying to do about it. This is a big field. One other thing that I'm particularly interested in myself, it's called payment for environmental services. Can I have the next slide? Some people think this is a little bit odd, strange bedfellows, that you have conservation, biodiversity, and markets, working together. It does seem a little bit odd. This is, by the way, not Photoshop. This is true. There's a
I'm wondering if they fed the lion.
No, I'll divert for a moment. This was actually kind of an odd thing. It was actually on the ranch of somebody that I knew in Kenya. And this female lion, I don't know if she lost her cubs or had some kind of traumatic incident in her life, but she started just adopting the baby gazelles. And she became quite famous for this. Fortunately, she would actually just keep them for a day or two and then let them go back to their mothers because she couldn't really feed them. But after a little while, she would get lonely and she'd go and kidnap another baby in her club.
Oh my goodness.
So she was, it was quite an odd story. But anyway, I just use it as the lion versus lying down with the lamb kind of thing, and as the contrast. Okay, next slide. So there are different ways of doing this payment, but the idea is basically to pay people to preserve biodiversity. Just let's say if we as a global society value biodiversity, we should be willing to pay to preserve it, and the people we mostly need to pay are the ones who are most likely to destroy it, which are mostly the people right around. So this is one project I personally was involved with in Uganda called the Mugahinga and Bwindi Impenetrable Forest Conservation Trust. And this Bwindi Forest, by the way, when I get around to pitching my novel, that's where that takes place, even though it's given a different name in the book. It's in the Bwindi Impenetrable Forest, which I love the name. And basically, it's the home of mountain gorillas, very endangered species. And the trust was set up originally in 1994 with $4 million worth of international money. It now has an endowment of about $10 million. And every year, the interest from that money is used to fund research, protection of the park, and also community activities. So, for example, setting up little chicken farms, and this is a tourism group of pygmies that set up a dance troupe that they can earn money from tourism, that sort of thing. So the interest from the trust goes to pay for these kinds of things, including more than half of it every year going to the local communities for various economic activities. And people know very well that the reason they're getting this money is because they have the mountain gorillas. They have the Bwindi Impenetrable Forest. And in fact, about a year ago, there was a big thing on I think I saw it on CNN and on NPR, where a baby gorilla was born and the community went through their traditional naming ceremony as though it were a child of the community, because they really value them. Next slide. A slightly more direct way is, this is another project that I was involved with, which I really found very interesting. The most direct thing is just to pay people and say, if you preserve the biodiversity, we will give you money. And we will give it, on a regular basis. And that's basically what this project was. This is the Nairobi National Park in Kenya. And the park itself is quite small. And in order to support the wildlife, it relies on dispersal areas all around the park. During the rainy season, the animals leave the park and they go out into these wider dispersal areas, which are occupied by and owned by local communities. So the objective of the project is to stop people from building fences and developing agriculture and doing things that would stop the wildlife from using these other areas. And the most direct way to do it is these wildlife conservation leases, where the organization negotiates with the individual landowners, and people get, at the moment, I think it's $4 an acre per year, and in exchange, they don't fence the area so that the animals aren't stopped. They don't put crop agriculture. They can have their livestock, but they don't put crops in. They don't build houses right in the paths of the migrating animals. And as long as they're willing to do that, they get paid for it from this trust fund. And one of the really interesting things is that a major impact of this trust fund in the area has been a very significant increase in the number of girls going to school. Because generally speaking, when there's very little money, the boys go to school and the girls don't. But what people need cash for is basically medicine and school. Those are the two things that people really need cash for. So that's been a very significant benefit of this program. Okay, next slide, please. Finally, we get to how can fiction help? Okay, and this is a somewhat younger me at the Norfolk Hotel working on my novel. Okay, so next slide. You must never underestimate the power of fiction. This is a slide that I use when I talk to grade schoolers. I hope you don't mind. Not all of them recognize who that is, but I'm sure you do. Okay, next slide. Okay, so, why write fiction? Obviously, we know, you tell stories, remind us of the history, etc., etc. Next slide, though. We also write fiction as a very important way to inform and educate and influence people. So each of these books here represents an important social movement that was very much influenced by the publishing of this particular fiction work. I'm sure you can guess which one do you think, what Uncle Tom's Cabin? Abolitionism, right? Black Beauty was the animal welfare. It was the start of the Royal Humane Society. The Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was basically triggered by the publication of Black Beauty. I don't know if anybody's read the book recently, but the horse goes through some very hard times, right? Grapes of Wrath, labor, migrant labor issues. This one you're less likely to know, but you can sort of guess. Maybe Monkey Wrench Gang. Did anybody is in the 60s?
Well, they're environmental activists.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, it was the Earth First.
Right.
It was triggered by this. So next slide shows all the answers. Yeah. So these are books that there were lots of books. For example, I remember reading about in Uncle Tom's Cabin. At the same time, there were people like Frederick Douglass that were writing enormously powerful treatises against slavery. But when Lincoln actually met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he called her the little woman who started the war, because people react to fiction. They react to stories that they can relate to. In many cases, more than to academic treatises and that sort of thing. So fiction can be very powerful. Next slide, please. Okay, so I don't put myself in the same category as those, but nevertheless, I have some things to share and some things I'd like to communicate. So for me, most of my writing is sharing my experiences in Africa, which I've been very lucky to spend quite a bit of time working and a few years living in East Africa mostly. So these are just, I want to share that experience, obviously. Next slide. But also, I really do feel that this fiction is an important way to inform people and influence people about what I care about, which is protecting nature and the environment. And so, for example, if we look at the next slide, we've got the novel that I was working on there, which is about bonobos, also known as pygmy chimpanzees, although they're not actually smaller than chimpanzees. Amazing animals, very, very endangered, much more so than regular chimpanzees or even gorillas. They're the most endangered of the great apes. They're our closest relatives by far, much more so than even regular chimpanzees. Something like 98.6% gene overlap or something, or even higher. Very, very intelligent, very social. You've probably heard about the chimpanzees who learn to sort of communicate by pointing to symbols. In fact, most of those are bonobos, not the regular chimpanzees. This one is Kwanzi, who's the most famous one, but there have been many others. They're extremely social. They're female-dominated. They're female-led compared to the male-led regular chimpanzees, and very peaceful. They're famous for making love, not war. Yes. So you might have read about this, that where there's any altercation over food or something, instead of attacking each other, they basically copulate instead, and that tends to bring the tension down. So magnificent animals. And so I wrote about them and about how they're being threatened and poached. And by personalizing them, the idea was to sort of communicate to a different group, not the people who read my scientific papers and books, but to other readers. And I know it's been a while since I published this book, but at first I was doing a lot of book tours, just locally, sort of talking at bookstores and that sort of thing. And a lot of people would tell me, for example, there's a scene there where it's made clear that in order to steal a baby of the bonobos, you have to kill the whole family because they will defend the baby. You know, and most people don't realize this, and they sort of come across as just somebody talking about it in the book. I couldn't bring myself to kill off even a fictional family of bonobos, but you know, people learn about this by reading things in fiction. Next slide, please. So I just like to put this in, you know.
That's adorable.
That's great.
Okay, next. Yeah. Okay, next slide. And then the most recent one, The Cheetah Who Wouldn't Run. It's a children's book. I have 3 children's books and 1 novel at the moment. And this one, again, about cheetahs. Highly endangered species, very, very vulnerable because of their lifestyle. They're attacked by everything out there. Very hard for them to survive. And this particular book was actually a birthday present to my mother, or a Christmas present, I think it was, yes. Because she came to visit me when I was living in Kenya, and we went to Nairobi National Park on safari. And there was a female cheetah there that was very, very well known throughout East Africa, because every year she raised large litters of cubs successfully. Wow. And it was a remarkable achievement. The mothers raise them all by themselves. They have to hunt every day, and they have to move the cubs around so that the predators can't find them. And she was just very well known for being an extremely successful mother. And when we saw her, and we saw how the cubs were seven. She had 7 cubs that year. Yeah, walking along behind her, she made a little noise. They all disappeared in the grass. She made another noise. They all came to her. My mother was very impressed and a little bit envious about how obedient these cubs were. So of course I wrote a book about a little cheetah cub that's not quite so obedient. Anyway, so next slide. And I like to show some of the fans of the book. Next slide, please. And then I'm working on a sequel, which is The Cheetah Who Wanted a Friend. And this is, again, to publicize a real thing. This is Lori Marker, Dr. Lori Marker. She's the head of the Cheetah Conservation Fund. And she hit on this idea of importing, these are Anatolian shepherd dogs from Turkey. And the Cheetah Conservation Fund gives these dogs to farmers, and they protect the sheep and goats and cattle so that the farmers don't go and kill the cheetahs. And so the dogs just grow up with the herds, with the flocks and herds, and they think of themselves as being members of the flocks. And the idea is that our heroine, little Mujubi the cheetah, is going to make friends with one of these puppies. Okay, next slide, please.
I think that's it.
Is it? I don't know. Is it? I think there might be one more.
No.
I'm pretty sure there is. There is one more.
I'm pushing it down.
Your dogs.
No, there's one more slide.
Find it.
Actually, there are a couple more. I don't know what's going on here, but you see there's another slide there. Can you just X out of that?
Yeah.
Okay. Uh-oh.
You lock up?
Seems to have locked up.
Well, hit escape and get out of the presentation.
Okay, yeah, let's try now. Okay, see if you can...
Hit escape.
There we go. Okay. All right. So these are just a couple of the other books. Your handout shows all the books. Next slide, please. Oh, I think that's the last one. Okay. So this is also just sort of a demonstration that a well-turned phrase can have a big impact. This is a gentleman named Baba Diom, just a functionary from Senegal. He was at a meeting of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in 1968 in New Delhi. And in his speech, he made this statement, and I've seen this everywhere. I've seen it on the door of the Monterey Aquarium in California. I've seen it at entrances to national parks. I've seen it, in Africa. I've seen it all over the place. And it's just a nicely turned phrase, can really capture people's imagination and make them think. So that's why I like to finish with this, because I think it's very true, you know, that we'll conserve what we love, we'll love what we understand, and we'll understand what we're taught. Okay, thank
Agi,
you.
can we back up to the bonobo
Sure,
line? Yeah.
sure, okay.
Back up 3 or 4 to the bonobos.
Mhm.
One more, keep going, keep going, keep going.
That one?
One more,
One more.
one more. Okay,
Uh-huh.
the lower right, I just want to.
Oh, yeah. Yes, they're very, very intelligent. Okay, that is it. Thanks very much for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Lights?
Yeah, let's turn the lights on. That's all right. This is not wildlife. This is very domestic life.
What are their names?
The little one is Tashi and the big one is Spencer. So,
I'm sure Agi will entertain questions.
I absolutely will. Or comments, experiences that you've had?
Wasn't there very recently some rich man, millionaire or something, who paid all this money to kill an animal that was endangered? I think there was a movie about that. I mean,
There probably was. I mean, it's not an unusual thing, unfortunately. There's a strange thing in, you know, people who like to do that kind of thing. I mean, I have to say, I've met big game hunters who are not like that. And as I say, it's not my thing, but I do sort of appreciate, like in southern Africa, they have game ranches, you know, that the people can go and they hunt. They're mostly collectors, you know, they want a species that they haven't got on their wall yet, that sort of thing. Not something I particularly care for, but at the same time, it is one way to make biodiversity valuable. Because it takes a lot of tourists with their cameras to equal the amount of money that, you know, somebody's willing to spend to shoot one animal.
Are they guaranteed to kill something, or they just pay the fee and then hope for the best?
They're pretty much guaranteed to. You know, well, for example, in a less unpleasant way, when you go to see the mountain gorillas in Uganda or in Rwanda, I mean, it's a long hike, you know, up mountains and through thick forest, but they have rangers who stay with the gorillas, so they always know where the gorillas are, so that there's a pretty good chance that unless they're too far away, you can't go and see them. You're not out there looking for them. They know where the animals are. And the hunters, I'm sure, do the same thing. So that if you have somebody who's, you know, paying $50,000, you don't want to disappoint them. Yeah. Yes.
Can you give us another example of when an animal is collected to the degree that the horseshoe crab is?
Oh,
It carves in whatever, you know, like in this case, the blood, and then put back. I thought that was interesting rather than just...
Actually, I can. One interesting thing, again, and I've just drawn my own experience. I've worked in Africa for many years, and for the last 10 years or so, I've worked in Europe and Central Asia, which, among other things, includes the Caspian Sea, which is Azerbaijan and Iran and Russia. You know. And there's a very, very valuable fish that lives in the Caspian Sea that produces caviar. It's the sturgeon, the Caspian sturgeon. And there's a lot of poaching of sturgeon, but actually the formal collection, they go out and they collect the females, and they bring them into these facilities, and they actually remove the eggs and then re-release the females. Because the female, they're very, very valuable, and you know, they're huge fish, and each one can produce tens of thousands of eggs. And there's a technology that's been developed where they can basically remove the eggs without hurting the female, and then they release her so that she can do it again next year. Which probably is not very pleasant for her, but is better than being killed off to produce the eggs.
How about for science purposes?
For science
Or
purposes.
for research purposes,
Yeah.
because that's for people to consume.
Right. Well, and I'm thinking of, for example, milking snakes for venom, but usually those are snakes that are kept captive. You know, they usually don't go out and collect them for that purpose. Usually they have breeding farms for these poisonous snakes, but for anti-venom or for research purposes,